And actually, to open up the questioning, I'm going to take one of the questions we've had online from Claire Brace-Girdle, and that is in part to encourage other questions online while we then move to all of you. So I will take this one specifically, and then others probably in groups. So Claire's question is, how has the number of state, non-state conflicts, or indeed non-state conflicts, as we're seeing in Iraq, affected the ability of humanitarians to work and their neutrality? How has the number of state, non-state conflicts, or indeed non-state conflicts, as we're seeing in Iraq, affected the ability of humanitarians to work and their neutrality? We've addressed it to some extent. Does anybody want to take that up specifically of Iraq?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to comment really about the fact that organisations must be allowed to speak to non-state actors, and really that this cannot be seen as an illegal occupation. It's essential that organisations have acceptance from all parties to a conflict, and this, when it involves a non-state actor, must include those individuals, and there should be no brake put on that, and that really is a really essential part of being able to access everybody who needs help in a given place, including in Iraq. Okay, good. And actually, I think this is also, it looks to be also from Claire, another follow-up, which I think we'll see if anybody else wants to ask questions about this subject. How about the effect... Oh, sorry, in fact, the first question was from Evelyn Van Colley. Right. Questioner changed. Anyway, whoever asked it, I hope you're happy with the answer. This one, how about the effect of military such as the United States distributing aid and then blurring the lines, which is obviously a hugely topical and growing issue in aid delivery? So does anybody else specifically want to ask a question around that? Is yours on a similar issue? Can we get a microphone to you? Maybe you just say who you are, if you wouldn't mind identifying yourselves for the panel.
Thank you very much. I'm the media counsellor at the Embassy of the Sudan in London. And thanks to the speakers. The point I would like to make is that although it's unacceptable, of course, to harm any humanitarian workers or obstruct their work, it's because they have come to help in a certain conflict, and they should be protected by the people they have come to help. But there is another dimension, which is sometimes humanitarian policies are embedded in great power policies, including the United States. One example is the United Nations itself is, for example, the lifeline helpline to the Sudan was used in order to feed the rebels in South Sudan against the government. And during the Darfur crisis, there were calls for humanitarian intervention in the Sudan, in the United States, by some politicians who are now in the position of authority, who said Sudan should be attacked militarily, right, for responsibility to protect people.
Yes, so the question out of it would be what? What is the question that you want to ask the panel out of that?
My question is that, is there a way to make sure that the politicization of presentation of aid is not embedded with far larger objectives of power politics?
Okay, no, thanks. It does in a way relate to the question we had online as well about is there a blurring of the lines between aid distributed by the military and aid distributed by humanitarian organizations? Let's just, before we, let's just take that round. Anybody want to take that one up, right? Have you still got...
I think it really comes back down to one of the things that we spoke to, addressed a little bit before, and that's international humanitarian law. The two issues, one of the military blurring the borders between political and military action and humanitarian action, is very clearly dangerous, and it's something that, for my mind, needs to be addressed. because it certainly places aid workers at risk. It also confuses it because soldiers doing humanitarian work is about as relevant as asking NGO workers to fight wars. But I'd also then say that taking the gentleman's point, international humanitarian law without any sanction, it means nothing. And consequently, I think the situation we're in now, where very often the answer when a politician is asked or a statesman is asked, what are you doing about this conflict in Syria or Iraq or wherever, and the answer is, we're sending humanitarian aid. That's not an answer at all. Humanitarian aid is not a solution. And solutions are separate, and indiscriminate attacks against civilians, which have happened and which are happening now, are breaches of international humanitarian law, and there must be international sanction against governments and combatants who breach international humanitarian law. That's tremendously important.
Okay, Ray, thanks very much. I'm going to get back to Larissa, actually, because you've been silent for this last 15 minutes or so, with those two questions very much in mind. The themes relate to one another, I think.
Sure, and I would say politicization is an important issue, especially regarding, attacks against aid workers. I don't think there's many people question that. My point is just that it doesn't explain everything. It's not that it's not relevant. So I do think that's important, and that's part of kind of checking perceptions about, aid work and whether it's being seen as neutral. Because it's one thing to claim neutrality. It's another thing, much more difficult, I think, to be actually seen as neutral or impartial. So, one of the recommendations I make at the end of the book is that I think there needs to be a concerted effort for aid agencies that choose that kind of principled stance to really embody those principles, not just to claim them. And I'm not saying that everyone doesn't, I'm just saying that that needs to be part of the picture. I think also donors have a responsibility here. There's, with the professionalization of the sector, and this is getting a little bit more afield, but with the professionalization of this sector, it's in part because donors are expecting, outcomes and project reports. So it means that aid workers themselves aren't necessarily spending as much time in the field as they might have, 10 or 15 years ago. So that then has repercussions, I think, for how people are seen. So it also then devalues some of these other potential responses that might help deal with some of these negative perceptions that might exist.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. Let's take some questions from within the room. You had your hands up first. You and the gentleman behind you.
Hi. Thanks. Is it on? Yeah.
It is, yes. If you just identify yourself, if you would.
That no one mentioned humanitarian negotiations, because it's definitely for us one of the sort of anecdotal things that we're finding with the sort of absence of actors in the hot zones, is that actually the kind of art of humanitarian negotiation with state actors and non-state actors is kind of dying out in some ways, and so actual contact between different armed actors and humanitarians is quite low, and I think the work that HPG has done on this is very interesting, and I think that's also what your researchers are saying. So I don't know, Larissa, did that come up in your book?
Absolutely. Yeah, it did, and I just haven't gotten around to it, but maybe we'll take a few questions, I think, and then I'll come back to that.
Yes, and in fact, Sarah has spoken a little bit about it already, but I'm sure we can take it further, so that'll be good. The next hand I saw was yours, and then over there.
Good afternoon. I'm Jean-Michel from ACF. So I didn't read your book, so I will not react to, I think, your interpretation of the mistake, except that I think politicization is something which happened in a lot of contexts, so was not sufficient enough in the decision-making process. But it leads me to my question about if it happened, is that because the armed forces, they feel impunity and immunity in that context. So I wanted to know if first you made an analysis on the perpetrators, their motivation. Normally it's kept within organization and it's not really to understand why they have committed. And my second question is that more and more NGOs are pushed to work together, to coordinate, to work as a group. And we all know that, as it was mentioned, NGOs are different and are respecting and are working around different criteria. Some are more aligned with government than others. And do you think that potentially for better security, some NGOs should go out of being perceived as part of a global group and should formulate a better individual identity which may protect them better? Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I'll take one more, but obviously that's quite specific as well for Larissa. And there was one hand up over here. It was yourself, right, in the front row.
Thanks very much. Just following on from Ray's point really about just how you can't really be asking soldiers to do humanitarian work because it's completely out of their remit. But then it's really a question of how you deal with these areas where the humanitarian need is, really sort of pressing, but these areas can't be reached, say, because of sort of the conflict in an area. In Somalia really sort of comes to mind. The ICRC sort of releasing a report. These are some of the worst hit areas, but we can't reach it because of the security situation. So how you go about sort of doing the sort of negotiations with humanitarian actors to reach those areas and how the professionalization of the service can actually be a sort of an asset in tackling those kind of issues.
Good. Okay. Other questions in a moment. Do you perhaps want to deal with that one specifically first, and then we'll broaden it out to everybody?
Yeah. First of all, as I said, I use that example as illustrative, so I'm not trying to point the finger at any...
just remind people this just about what the attack was.
Yes, sorry, the ACF, the 17 aid workers that were killed in Sri Lanka in 2006. So one of the points that I make, I try and tread as lightly as possible, because I think there's a real balance between kind of blame, which is where a lot of people tend to go, and understanding. And my main goal is to promote understanding. I mean, the blame for the act of killing 17 ACF staff needs to rest with the people who did it. And so I'm...
We're being asked if you know who that was.
Yes, and I have read the reports, and my understanding from what has been publicly released and from what I know is that it was the military who perpetrated that, who perpetrated that act. So my purpose is to show the complexity of that situation, and to really, one of the things that I do rely on is respect for international law and addressing actually the impunity of perpetrators, that there needs to be more state responsibility with relation to acts of violence against aid workers and others. The other point that I do make is that I do think diversity in the humanitarian world is actually a good thing. So I think that some organizations trying to kind of create a different kind of identity is a positive. The one thing I think that sometimes that distinction can also make you a target. And so that is both, as they say, it's a double-edged sword. And I think that then if an organization chooses to go in that direction, then that's something that needs to be done very deliberately and with, a lot of reflection.
Okay. Thank you. I think our other questions essentially were both dealing with negotiations with people a government might not want, host government might not want you to negotiate with. But I suppose the context of that is, if a cumulative effect of violence is to make access more difficult, is that becoming more important? How effective can it be? How difficult is it? Does it then raise new dangers? You've already dealt with it to some extent from the research you've done here. So we answer those questions.
I think that to try and work in conflict and not have contact with combatants, it's a ridiculous proposition. What you do need to do, though, is to lay down rules, and as far as possible ensure that all responding agencies agree on those rules, or at least agree where they disagree. One of the experiences that we've had in certainly in Syria, for instance, is where we've been able to make combatants understand why we're there, what we're doing. It's clear that you have less problems in those circumstances, and you have more ability to work with people in authority when things go wrong, and so that engagement has to happen. One of the things, for instance, we've just done recently in Syria is agree a working protocol. Now that's quite unusual, because everything in that protocol for engaging with combatants is something that NGOs have understood for many years. That protocol should have been there and should have been used. And on the point of Somalia, I would argue that if that protocol had been used right at the beginning as a common working practice, then it may very well have worked positively for everybody working there.
I might, if that's okay, you directly respond to the Somalia point regarding the distribution of humanitarian assistance by the military. I think that was the specific question. No. Would you mind clarifying?
I think just in terms of, I think the ICRC specifically said, they can't reach certain areas in Somalia because of the conflict between Al-Shabaab as well as sort of Amazon forces. So how do you sort of deal with that if the military shouldn't really be doing that type of work? How do you professionalize the sort of humanitarian sector? How do you have these sort of negotiations with armed groups in order to ensure access while also sort of keeping violence against aid workers to a minimum?
Okay, I think I understand a bit better. Just to I guess my first point is that where armed forces are party to a conflict, it's primarily their responsibility to ensure that populations within their control have access to healthcare, and have the means to live. And I think that's something that is primarily the responsibility of authorities in control of areas where populations live. And then in terms of the struggles in Somalia in particular and elsewhere where humanitarian organizations don't have access, it's extremely difficult, and Somalia is a very sad example, unfortunately, of that. I think it's essential to be aware of what the blocks are to access, to be able to look critically at the way in which organizations work and the way in which that can be enhanced, and to be aware of why that access may be denied actively as well as because of lack of security. And I think that information learning and sharing and critical analysis hopefully helps organizations to be able to get out there and to do what they need to do and to respond to the needs of people as broadly as possible. So that would be, I guess, my direct response. And yeah, I think, Larissa, I'll pass back over to you for the humanitarian negotiations point.
Yeah, and so I realized I didn't actually answer that question. So I do devote a part of one chapter to what I call the consent-based approaches, which to me include humanitarian negotiations as well as an acceptance approach that requires gaining consent for the presence and activities of an organization from all stakeholders, which is a tricky proposition in many cases, but it's still something that I think needs to be done. So, and I would actually say, and this is one of the things I do also recommend, is that, you know, there needs to be more, you know, we hire aid workers for their technical expertise in, say, you know, nutrition or water and sanitation, or, you know, in medical care. But we don't necessarily hire aid workers for their expertise in negotiation, or, you know, even in kind of communication outside of PR, you know, some of those quote unquote softer skills that I think are really crucial to the success of the humanitarian endeavor. And I would say that those kinds of skills would be precisely what would make someone really good at negotiating with armed actors. So I do think there needs to be more emphasis on that. And then the other point, you know, I also want to say, you know, I was actually an aid worker at one point in my life. I've been an academic for a while, but I also recognize that it's a lot easier for me as an academic to kind of you know, to step back and talk about the these issues. I do recognize that most aid agencies are doing the best that they can in very difficult circumstances. So it's also easier for me to look back on these cases and say, you know, there was this, this, and this. So I'm thinking here of the ACF case, which was a tragedy for the organization. You know, there's lots of other examples that I pull out in the book. It's easy for me to comment on those, but I'm not the one making the decisions, and I do recognize that.
Thank you. Let's take one or two of the online questions now, coming in almost thick and fast here. We'll start at the bottom here. From Ron Fitzherbert: is the proliferation of aid actors as much a part of the problem as anything else? Cluster coordination doesn't control the message seen by the various sides. So is there a cost in this proliferation of aid agencies? And to avoid the word actors, I'd rather hope as a journalist that we were going to have the whole day without the word actors, but I knew it was a lost cause. So anyway. Who wants to take up whether there's an excessive proliferation? Yep, so that, okay, yeah, we'll add another one to that, yep. Which is from Rahel Detz, Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin. How can humanitarian organizations measure aid effectiveness in insecure and violent settings? Could M&E contribute to assessing and perhaps even resolving risks? And if so, how? Let's take those two together. So aid effectiveness in insecure settings and clusters and proliferation.
I think to take the last point first, I think that very often conflict and working in conflict is the reason why monitoring and evaluating your work is difficult. It should never be an excuse for not doing it. And there is no reason why you can't effectively monitor in conflict. There are going to be times when the quality is going to be reduced, but it's even more important that you do it. And I would have to say that one of the challenges that we've faced in Syria has been the disparity between the Damascus-based distributions and those from Turkey, and the complete mystery of one side of the country against what we've been able to do in the north, where the conflict is actually much hotter, and its willingness to do it and a commitment to doing it, that it is tremendously important.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I'll take the proliferation one. I mean, I think definitely seeing, you know, a number of what I call fly-by-night organization, prop up in crisis is not welcome because, in many cases are not, sort of professional or reliable. But there's another type of proliferation that is very important, significant, and should be encouraged and supported, which is, the number of local, national, regional organizations that are growing, of southern-based organizations that are growing and becoming stronger. And that should be encouraged and strengthened, actually, because they will be those, closer to crisis, that will have, cultural proximity in many cases that can be useful, that can, be able to broker access in a different way. And it's incumbent on more mature and experienced organizations to make sure that, they become part of the professional, reliable, humanitarian community, and they, become full members, if you want, of the community of actors that respond to these crises.
Some of them might resist it, thinking of themselves differently.
Yeah, definitely. I think at the moment there is a hierarchy in the sector which is not healthy.
There's a question which does link us into that, actually, from Len Rubenstein, Center for Public Health and Human Rights, Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Does our emphasis on neutrality put local health workers who can't be neutral because of affiliation or religion, etc., but are equally entitled to protection at greater risk?
Hi, yes, no, it's nice to have a question from Len, who's worked with the ICRC in particular on the Healthcare in Danger project, which nicely segues me, gives us an opportunity to talk about that. No, I think that local healthcare workers, just as local aid workers are, especially at risk where conflict is dramatic, but I think that this question goes back to the fundamental challenge, which is delivering healthcare to those in need, and it's because of the local health workers who may be able to better get to the people who require urgent care in conflict and situations of violence, that they're therefore have to move across front lines and are not given perhaps the space that they require to be able to even receive medicines from the local city, or depending on the context, or indeed patients are unable to travel to them. I think it's extremely difficult, but one thing I would say is that there are steps that can be taken by all actors, by healthcare workers themselves, to develop contingency plans, to understand what and have a look at what they could do if violence, which perhaps is 2 neighbourhoods away, comes to their town. Do they have a safe place where they can take patients, and preferably underground, for example, where they can hide from the effects of fighting, or do they have other ways of protecting themselves? And equally, just to reinforce this fact that healthcare is protected under law and yet isn't in practice, and this must be shouted from the rooftops, and I think it's the responsibility of the international community broadly to emphasize this.
Good. Just before I give it back to you, I'm going to take one more so we can get as many questions in as possible. And it's from Paul Greening, humanitarian aid worker, calls himself. The UN and specifically OCHA tend to offer little protection through advocacy, with the fear of annoying national governments. Should they do more? So why don't you start by answering that, and then other points you wanted to take.
Okay. So, I mean, I think advocacy should be part of advocacy in terms of, international law and IHL, international humanitarian law in particular, which gets to Len's point about the protection of or the influence of neutrality. I mean, I think part of one of the points I do make, I think quite strongly in the book, is the need to think about aid workers as civilians. And, Ray, you made that point earlier. There's, I think, a danger in exceptionalizing aid workers as a kind of special population in need of protection. We can't also lose sight of the fact that it's the civilians that aid workers are there to help who cannot leave, really. International aid workers are able to leave for the most part. And that's, I think, an important thing to keep in mind. National staff, are, for a variety of reasons, it's harder to kind of evacuate them, for example, like visas. But there are possibilities for moving them to safer places, perhaps, within a country. So I do think, that point about thinking about the protection of aid workers as part of the protection of civilians really needs to be brought out. I would also quickly respond to the question about measuring effectiveness. I mean, one of the things that we did with our work on acceptance as a security management approach is thinking about the ability to continue to operate on a regular basis, gaining access, not just one-time access, but continual access, might be a way of measuring effectiveness, certainly in terms of, providing that assistance.
Thank you very much indeed. Questions within the room now. 1, 2, 3. Your question, please. I saw one behind, and then Mervyn.
Besides visible violence, you mentioned structural violence of inaccessibility, denial of access to aid agents, which has been happening to the north and east in Sri Lanka for within this 8 years of this regime alone. That has been happening from the time of independence. But I am talking about this regime of 8 years last year. You mentioned that this UNICEF, UN people talking about their advocacy work. UNICEF person who talked about the malnutrition of children there was expelled. So that is one act of the governments, these oppressive governments. And the whole issue of this violence against aid workers is the tip of an iceberg of a bigger problem in all these countries. I want to say that the aid agent 17 case is one of scores of cases which the government is refusing to take it up in the courts. And only one case, the British aid worker who was killed 2 or 3 years ago, was taken up and resolved because of British pressure. All the other hundreds of cases are unresolved. They are not taken up by this oppressive government.
Thank you very much, Steve. We'll take that as a comment, I think, rather than necessarily a specific question, but that it's what we see happening to aid workers is symptomatic of something else, I think, is the bigger point you're making. Could I just... Yes, okay, all right.
I'm sorry, do you want to...
It's all right. No, you go.
Hi, my name's Letty Thomas. I'm a freelance researcher. Following up from the question online about coordination is a word that's bandied around a lot, and on the ground, what it often comes down to is a key relationship between the NGOs, INGOs and national NGOs in UN agencies and UN peacekeeping missions. Are we getting to the point, given that a lot of NGO information comes from the UN, a lot of understanding of context comes from the UN, I wonder, and this may be controversial, I wonder, are NGOs themselves, for lots of very good reasons, becoming too reliant on UN infrastructure, UN information to conduct their operations and understand how to work?
Thank you. And immediately behind you while the microphone's there, and then to Mervyn. No, okay. To Mervyn then, please. Yeah.
Thank you. Mervyn Lee from Mercy Corps. It really follows on very much from that last comment there. And Larissa, forgive me, I haven't read your book yet. But is it not the case that the world we work in, the world that we deliver aid in, has changed dramatically in the last few years? You said 12 years ago you were talking about aid workers in the field. And there's also in the conversation, I'm slightly... again, be slightly critical of the conversation. There's been talk about aid workers and then pulling out international aid workers. Most of our aid in Mercy Corps, 100% of Reg's aid, 95%, is delivered by national people. In Afghanistan, we've got 400 staff, 4 are expats. So we need to talk about these people in the same voice. But the point I'm making is that the dynamics have changed, and organizations to deliver, and this will be increasingly so, in complex emergencies, such as Syria, Iraq, etc., have to shape themselves for that.
Larissa.
Okay. Let me take that last question first. Yes, I do think there has been a dramatic change, but I also think that to say that some of these patterns weren't present before is also not true. The politicization of aid has been there all like throughout kind of the history of humanitarianism. I mean, that's part of the findings of the Humanitarian History Project, you know, and other books, you know, I'm thinking of The Golden Fleece, which is another book that kind of looks over time. So, I mean, yes, I do think there are some significant changes, and the proliferation of actors, I think, would be one of those. But I also think that to kind of take a short view, I mean, I think there is a tendency within the humanitarian community to kind of think shorter term, in the because everything is immediate, and that makes sense. But I think there's also a lot of value in thinking historically.
I'm going to just put one in there. Didn't the nature of that politicization change very sharply after 9/11 and become more global? The politicization itself became more uniformly global, if you like, between the West and the rest.
Yeah, I mean, I think yes. I mean, to some extent, but I'm. I don't know. I'm not quite as convinced that it wasn't there before. But okay. So then, but I think you're right that there are many more actors now than there used to be. Do you want to say something?
I think it's a different. Obviously, there's been a historical evolution of the type of politicization we see. I mean, during the Cold War, we saw very politicized aid along the split that existed during the Cold War. Obviously, we are in a phase post 9/11 where we see a very strong anti-Western backlash in a number of contexts, and unfortunately, the fact that this remains an industry that it is strongly dominated still by Western organizations means that there is there are attendant consequences for organizations that are seen as representing, the hegemonic power of the West in contexts where this hegemony is strongly contested. So we cannot, sort of disassociate ourselves from the context that, in a way, has given birth to the organizations.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay.
Could I just quickly say that I think it's true that things have changed. But surely a lot of that is a consequence, one of the use of wide-scale bombardments by responsible powers, as they'd have referred to themselves, to solve very specific questions. And I think, secondly, the general nature of the war on terror idea and how that's complicated things.
Okay, that's good. We've got a couple of very good questions online, which I just want to get in our remaining 5 minutes or so. Do you just want to take up that question?
The reliance of on the UN. In terms of, I think there would be some disagreement on that. I mean, I think a lot of NGOs would say, no, we don't rely on the UN. But the UN might have a different perception. So I think I do think that there is, there's some agencies that have very strong kind of capacity to analyze, the context. In some ways, I think there's a lot more reliance on some of the private sector for some of these skills as well. In terms of, some of the protection, unarmed protection, as well as in some cases armed protection that occurs in different contexts. And even, some of the work around, say, kidnapping and ransom, that's often done by private sector, not by aid agencies themselves. I mean, it's specialized knowledge, and there is a role for that as well.
Thanks very much indeed. Couple of online questions, as I say. Rachel Kidell-Munro from MSF. How should NGOs position themselves when UN integrated missions take on offensive roles, as is the case with the intervention brigades in DRC? Now, that's a country we haven't picked out specifically, of course, with enormous humanitarian needs. Anybody want to take that one? Or Larissa, do you? As
that's actually something that I'm looking with some colleagues. We're planning to do some analysis on that. So I defer that until we've done that analysis. It's a bit of a cop-out, but...
Right. And also again from Rachel, this links to the issue of independence of NGOs, including financial independence from states with political interests in the conflict concerned. I'm not quite sure exactly what questions that sharpens into. Maybe it's more of an observation. But from NGO Safety, a collection of former aid workers, what steps can be taken to help end impunity for those who attack aid workers?
I mean, I think that's part of the role of World Humanitarian Day, is to kind of raise awareness and perhaps put pressure on states to actually prosecute these crimes. So I think that is, something that can happen with days like World Humanitarian Day. I don't know if anyone else wants to do that.
Hi, I'd just like to quickly add, which is that it essentially this is an issue of compliance with international law, which says that an aid worker is a civilian, and that it's tragic when an aid worker dies. It's also tragic when a civilian dies, and there cannot be impunity for transgressions of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, which exists to protect those civilians as well as others in their other role in as parties to a conflict. So it's really a case of the international community's responsibility, as well as those individual parties to a conflict, states and non-state actors in a given situation, to ensure that more is made of this. That this is something that we need to talk about. We need to address, and that specifically in specific contexts, we must ensure that there's pressure brought to bear by perhaps third states on those who they have influence over when it comes to disobeying these laws of war.
Another question very much related to all this. Amory Cooper online. International NGO Safety and Security Association. Do you think aid and development organizations allocate enough money and time to staff safety and security training? Who would like to answer that?
But I think they would like to allocate a lot more if the donors made, enough provision for them to be able to do so.
I imagine the question is saying, within the budget available, do they allocate enough time and money?
Again, from my personal experience, I think that's what they would like to do more. But there are incredible constraints on how you put together a budget. And again, from our research, what we have seen is that enlightened donors have allowed organizations to invest part of their budgets in training their staff, or in spending enough time to understand the context and negotiate access. They've resulted in much better programming and interventions and safety for the aid workers deployed. But unfortunately, we're still far away to seeing enough donors enlightened enough to make sure that this can happen significantly. We do see provision in donor budgets for security, but very often is, if you want physical security, it's the fortressing. If you want that is provided for, is some of the bunkerization that is better understood, that the investment in the training and the soft support for the aid workers that are deployed.
Right. Yes.
Can I make hopefully a quick comment? I'll try to keep it brief. I do think that security budgets need to also be seen as part of programming budgets, because security is very much linked to programming and effective programming as well. So that would be one thing I would say. I also would love to see donors kind of put think about something like drinking tea and developing relationships, which doesn't have a tangible outcome, but can have very tangible security benefits. I'd like to see them think about that as something that is more, that is fundable and that is important. Yeah.
Absolutely. I'd like to just bring in for a final comment, perhaps unless it's a specific question, but it's the European Interagency Security Forum, who are not only present but have been involved in this session as well. Raquel, do you want to just almost our concluding thought, I think?
Okay, thank you very much. Just to say thank you all to the panel for a very interesting discussion, and a timely moment, I think, to reinforce what Larissa has just been saying around inclusion of budget. And sometimes it's not actually the donors who are saying, no, you can't fund security. interventions, but it's within the NGOs themselves who don't understand what security is. Often security is being seen as the the high walls, the barbed wire. What we need to think about, it's about risk management. Ray mentioned that not enough is being done to understand the risks and develop appropriate measures to tackle them. I hope we're moving in the right direction. There are people, the risk book is helping, other activities are helping to really put this issue on the table, but unless risk is identified at the design stage of programs, we're not going to be able to create the safe environment and the sustainable programming we want to achieve. Thank you.
Larissa.
Yeah, just and one kind of final comment. I recognize that, you know, clearly not everyone is going to agree with everything I say, and that actually I think is a good thing. And so really one of my goals for writing this book and putting this out there is to prompt a discussion and a debate about some of these issues. And I really hope that my book can be part of that discussion and debate. And I thank you for coming to listen to some of this.
And I noticed that somebody who's been following us very closely online, Paul Greening, humanitarian aid worker, we had a question from him earlier, is indeed saying should donors take more responsibility for the protection of aid workers? Do they have responsibility to speak up, as for example in the case of the census in Myanmar? So we've got one other country in here, at least in that form anyway. And on donors, Justine Greening, the International Development Secretary, said of this day, British humanitarian workers, the difference between life and death in countless trouble spots around the world, including Iraq, Gaza and South Sudan. World Humanitarian Day recognises aid workers of all nationalities who've chosen to put themselves in the most inhospitable places, often in extreme danger, to alleviate the suffering of millions affected by conflict, natural disasters and deadly diseases. And you might just be interested, if you don't know already, that the British government, as chair of the UN Security Council at the moment, is actually leading a high-level briefing or discussion in the Security Council today on the question of greater protection for aid workers. So, on that note, and only just a little late, I'm glad to say, I didn't give you my name at the beginning, and I apologise when I introduced everybody else. Mike Wooldridge is my name, so I want to thank you very much indeed for not just coming, but taking part so actively in this discussion, and all who followed it online and on Twitter or in other imaginative ways. And to very much thank the panel, Ray and Sarah, and of course, perhaps particularly to Larissa for coming and talking about her, in many ways, challenging and provocative, very readable book. So thank you very much indeed to all of you. A video recording of this event will be available in a few days, I'm told. There are refreshments outside the room. So please stay and talk to the panelists, talk to the author, Larissa, and indeed pick up a copy of the book, which I'm sure she'll be pleased to sign. And to those who are interested, just to remind you again, the what's been called the National Memorial, first one that has happened in Britain, of World Humanitarian Day at Westminster Abbey, and people will be making their way from here around 4:30. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.